We'll start with 2 questions, and then please feel free to ask any questions you may have about their work. We only ask that you try to be as mindful as possible of the language that you use when you're asking those questions. So, Helen. Just say this to me. Your voice is more. I'd like to ask you first about the significance of this first film. We have There's a Hole in the Sky, part 1. And I'd like, because obviously the theme is artificial boundaries, what would you say is the significance of location in the film? On the one hand, Barbados, and also you chose sugar and rum plantations.
Okay, that's a big question.
It is a big question.
I mean, the practical answer to part of it is that I had a residency in Barbados. But the reason that I applied for the residency in Barbados was because I am interested in the idea of kind of manifestations, I suppose, of the repercussions of kind of colonial economy, but also colonial culture and structures within society. So my dad was born in Cuba, my dad's family are Jamaican, and so going to Barbados was then about not making a work that was really personal, but it was about some of the personal, almost kind of generational memories that I have. That are not my memories, but they're the kind of passed down memories. So it was about going to a place that allowed me to explore some of those things. So the economic, the historical, the social, the political kind of structures that I would find in a space that was of the Caribbean. And about the idea of going in with the sugar industry was about the kind of construction, I suppose, of Caribbean society, the way that people arrived there, the reason that they were brought to the Caribbean, the way society was structured around a particular kind of colonial industry. It's really interesting to me, and I'm interested in histories, and I'm interested in repercussions that kind of flick down, travel down through generations, from one generation to the next, really, I guess. So Barbados allowed me the kind of space to explore. So I worked in the archives there, and the National Museum there have a kind of massive bank of archives about many different things, but the sugar industry was a thing that I got excited about. I wanted to try and make some sense of that, and because I knew that the sugar industry is really failing in Barbados, and it used to be the industry that kept the island going. It's a small island, and it underpinned everything. And now there's one sugar plantation that's still working, and one sugar factory that's producing sugar. And so I wanted to look at that, how ecosystems are changed and how kind of economic structures are developed and then they're pulled away again as kind of the global need and want changes and shifts. So sugar beet that's grown in the US and in Europe has changed the kind of the stake that Barbados and Caribbean nations have in an industry that was kind of imposed upon them or built around them. Both of those two things. Did that answer it?
Absolutely, absolutely. Yes, amazing, thank you. And for you, Raj, I'd like to start with the political aspect of your work. So I personally see your work as not only political, but it is obviously confrontationally political in that it forces the viewer to consider violence of colonial histories and post-colonial practices. So it's not something that's, that we've moved past. What do you seek to evoke within the viewer in general? And what do you hope to give those who descend from people so negatively affected by the scenes depicted in your works?
That is also a very big question. So if I take it apart, first part, for years I avoided the frame of political. I avoided it because I often felt that the way political art is defined was far too narrow for what I was trying to do. And the reason for that is that my work about violence is deeply but I'm situating that personal charge into political stories. So there's a personal history of violence that I then am somehow connecting with social and political histories of violence. And I think some of what I'm trying to elicit in the viewer is some kind of emotional response that is not typical of one's experience when they think of political art or a political experience so something that's talking about power. For me, the way abuses of power function are deeply intimate. They are experienced by the body, and that's this deeply visceral, emotional, bodily experience that I'm trying to bring into the realm of politics. That I think sometimes, and so that's the kind of area I'm trying to traverse. There's a second part to the question.
What do you hope to give people who were affected by those histories?
It's interesting that you asked that because I just started a portrait series of women called Do You Know Our Names? And it is based on ethnographic portraits of women, native women, taken by European scientists around the turn of the century. And often these photographs were incredibly brutal. There's no recording of the individual, the name. They're quite brutal. The women are often posed without clothing. And in the portrait series, I reproduced these photographs so that the women are kind of larger than life size, and then I paint on top of them in a kind of restorative act. So I give them clothing, I give them makeup, I give them hair, and for me it's really personal. Like I feel, I've never felt the kind of joy and the kind of joy I felt in restoring a kind of identity to the women in this portrait series. And I think like the works here were precursors. Like I was trying to get to where I've gotten in the portrait series that I started this year with these. These are also tribal, anonymous, photographed people that ended up in European archives, German archives, and I drew them and then painted on top of them. Kind of camouflage imagery. I'm thinking a lot about who gets pathologized today, who gets criminalized today, and then what are the antecedents of this visually. And so I'm looking for that in the archives. And so I feel very lucky to be introduced to your work and to be showing with you, because I feel like there's some kind of convergence of research methodologies. I'm often working with archives and history, but then I'm going into the studio and then kind of drawing and painting and trying to transform them and produce a third thing that doesn't exist in the archives. So something like a restoration of dignity, like an identity, and being able to answer back to this type of representation that's so brutal and that is with us today. Thank you.
We can take some questions from the audience if someone would like to ask a question. If we're there yet, we're ready for questions. Still a little shy? Okay, don't worry. I came prepared for that. Helen, I'd like to ask you, because you mentioned it in your first answer about the personal stories. So you chose Barbados because it wasn't as personal as perhaps going to Cuba or Jamaica would have been. But in some of your work, you do use personal stories of your family members and yourself to tell stories, and you explore themes within that around migration, volunteering and involunteering, as well as constructs of race and identity. How did you come to choosing that path of using personal stories in your art?
I think I'm really interested in the idea of kind of ownership of what you make, and there's something about acknowledging that. So if I place myself in the frame, then I'm in it, and I can't take myself out of it. And I'm really interested in the idea that when you speak about yourself, you're also speaking about much wider issues. Everyone is, like, not just me or you, or we all are, like, so this idea of political work, I would say that all work is political, because we are political, we are beings, and, you know, we have relationships to everybody else around us, and so as soon as you make work, you're making a political statement, whether or not you acknowledge that. So I want to have a stake in the work that I make. That's really important to me. And actually, I'm probably going to sound a little bit like you, but the idea that you are touched by something, so therefore you want to somehow communicate that to somebody else, and that's about the politics of it, but it's also about the emotions of it. It's about the psychological impact, and there's something about finding a way for yourself into a piece of work, but there's also a way of trying to communicate that. And so if you bring yourself and your family or relationships that you have into that, then you can of course speak about gender and race and kind of different kinds of social politics, economic, global, or, you know, all of those can be touched by those conversations if you bring it down and understand where it's coming from for you. So it's a mechanism for me to talk about much more complicated and complex and wider conversations, is to kind of use kind of relationships that I have and that I can own as a way of having those conversations. So.
It does, it makes sense. And what would you say about the role of migration in those stories?
Well, I suppose, you know, one of the things that I've always held in my mind was my dad was much older than my mum, and talked about being born or living in a community in Jamaica, this was after he left Cuba, where there was somebody who lived in the village who was a slave. And this idea that we think we've moved so far that histories don't touch us, that they're kind of, you know, they're so far away from us. And yes, my dad was much older than my mum, and so it's kind of, we've kind of skipped generations, but actually that's 2 generations away from being a slave. And so there's something about the way that you can touch I'm talking about this idea of the kind of haptic quality of histories, is that you feel like you can touch something that's happening and has happened, and it's not that far away from you. And so there's something about trying to work that into what I'm trying to say, because it's real for me, and it will be real for other people who've been through, you know, many different things. The world is completely crazy at the moment, and there people are experiencing things that I can never imagine. But they will know it and they will understand it. So it's this idea that we don't think we know everything, and that we're open to hearing it and feeling it and touching it when somebody brings it to us. So I think it's about that really.
And in a similar way, because you already mentioned what you're working on currently, that work is for the Welt Museum in Vienna. And I'm wondering, because it is so profound, the experience for you creating it, but also the process of going through those pictures. How did you make the decision to do this work and then exhibit it at this particular place that has a kind of like a National Geographic history?
Yes, the Welt Museum was formerly Das Museum for Local Kunde in Vienna, and they've been closed for 3 years. And rather progressive person who has left the museum initiated a project called Switch, and this was a Europe-wide project where ethnographic museums were kind of trying to come to terms with what role they play today. And many of them are trying to make this very awkward and politically dubious shift from exploiting communities to serving communities. So trying to be pro-refugee, pro-immigrant. They want to be a space where, like, for instance, a Filipino community can come and look at their objects in the, you know. And for me, the way I entered into this exhibition was I proposed a project for a residency, and they had a residency, a part of the Switch program that was like 8 museums across Europe have been kind of going into this question of their relevance today. And I felt like one cannot jump over the tremendous history of violence that an institution like that is embedded in. And in certain ways, I made the proposal in the exhibition, borrowed the title from Donna Haraway, and it's called Staying with Trouble. And so she asked a set of questions. What does it mean to act right and think in an age of extinction and extermination? And for me, that was like, well, an ethnographic museum is kind of at the heart of that, because an ethnographic museum is like sort of the instrument of imperialism, like kind of like the ultimate, you know, kind of central institution. So in its founding, in the objects, in how it acquired those objects, lay the stories of all the kind of modern crises we're facing, from environmental collapse to refugees to terrorism to everything that you can think of. It's like, for me, it's embedded into the history of a place like that and into the history of colonialism. And so I proposed really to look at the history of this violence. And I did a residency there for 2 months last year, and then I kind of worked with the materials and then continued this exhibition there. But for me, it kind of I've been working for almost 20 years, and it's a kind of synthesis of all of my thinking about colonial histories and how they connect to the present day. It kind of all just sort of comes there. And it seems to be like somehow the perfect place for it.
Yeah.
The contradictions and everything is very right.
And the cycle. We were talking about before about the cycles, that we're not changing, they keep coming, they keep coming, and we're not doing enough. We're not doing anything to break those cycles, and they just keep revolving and keep revolving and keep revolving.
Except technology accelerates the capacity for destruction far more than it ever has. So then it's like, it is something new, but it's the same cycle of violence, In that we've gone so far in terms of accelerating our ability to destroy.
Any questions from you? Yes.
I would ask both of you about for the works I've seen so far. I haven't seen all of the videos, but about your aesthetic approaches in the work, in particular. So you I just saw this video. I found it has a very particular, let's say, speech to work with softness and to speak what kind of images you show and what kind of tone you speak in your voice. So I would be interested to know a little more about that. Is that something you regularly work on, particularly chose to work in this studio, and if why? And you, which I would ask about the process in restoring those people's identities and lives, histories, apart from the fact that I'm not a painter, but if I would imagine trying to do that, I would have in mind a big discussion with myself what I would choose for actually, and how can you maybe describe a little bit about the process of deciding for one way of painting, or maybe how many different ideas of layers, or many different versions of maybe one formation of the personal identity I have.
Which one first? Okay. So I guess so aesthetically, I guess I'm really interested in form, and we have, I guess, a photographic background. So that's sort of where that comes from. The idea of the kind of the forming image is really important to me. But it's also about the pace and the stillness and the slowness, because I suppose a lot of what's being said is quite wordy. I like words and I write lots, so the scripts are very word heavy. And so it's important, I think, that there's space between the image and the word, if that makes sense. So you can have time and space to think about what's being said, and sometimes the image will reinforce that, and sometimes it will change it, and sometimes it will contradict it, and so that's the aim, is that this kind of slowness, the pace in it enables you to kind of sit with it and be with it, and then sometimes it will shift it or confuse it or support it. And all the scripts, I guess, are written in a way, I kind of work in quite a fragmentary way, so I'll use text from kind of philosophical text, I'll use song, I'll use kind of prose, I'll use poetry, and then I'll try and weave the script together. So you're sort of moving as well with what you're hearing a lot. So yeah, so I'm really interested in, I don't know if I was having a conversation with recently where people kind of talk about you making political work, and I will always want to have a conversation about the aesthetic and form, because that's as important as kind of the content and what we're trying to say. For me, it's really important that I feel that the process for the viewer and that I'm communicating something in the way that I want to communicate it. So of course the way that I construct it is really considered and is really important to me.
And structurally, it's like a collage.
Yeah, it's collage, yeah.
What about you?
So similarly, I am very committed to the mediums of drawing and painting, and sort of the formal aspects or the formal structure of the work is very integral. It's not somehow secondary. So a lot of my work can look very different from one another depending on what I'm working with. I often try to find the right visual language to carry the weight of a particular subject or topic. The portraits that I spoke of earlier that are at the Weltmuseum in Vienna, and these were kind of a precursor. I think there I'm working with photographic reproductions that I then paint by hand on top of. And so a lot of it, some of it in terms of painting the skin, it feels like I'm kind of reenacting like a 19th century photographer who's colorizing photographs. But then I'm altering the reading of the image so that you cannot read it in the same way. But a lot of it is instinctual. And a lot of it is based on, I have a kind of process where, with this material, it began with taking apart an anthropology book from 1902 called Die Woche der Erde. It's a German anthropology book. And it's filled with photographs of people from all over the world. And some of them are very brutal and abject in terms of their depiction. And I cut the book apart and started a series of just kind of very immediate reactions. So I paint and draw on them. Some of the drawings are good, some of the drawings are not so good, but it's more like the gesture. And in Vienna, like I have this large wall installation of 70 of these book pages. It's more about the gesture of cutting the book apart and reacting on it. And from this book, there are certain images that kind of speak to me and want to be made into something bigger. And this is where the portrait series came out of. So, a figure this big inside the book, I've blown up so that suddenly this woman is staring at you and she's larger than you in terms of scale. And then in terms of my intervention, it's largely intuitive, right? And I think it's reflective of where I am in my life right now. And so right now, the impulse, the instinct is restoring a kind of dignity, rather than highlighting highlighting the violence that's been done to the women already. It's shifted into giving them somehow a kind of agency and voice. And I think with these early works, I was also like, with these ones that are here, I was trying to deal with agency. So how do these kind of subjects that are from in these 19th century or early 20th century photographs that are kind of objects of study, how do I give them a voice to act back? And in some early works, I started to kind of give them weapons, arm them, really like just kind of a literal shifting of iconography of how you read these individuals. And yeah, so it's intuitive, but it's really based on like kind of where I am at in my life as well.
Thank you.
Perhaps one last question?
That's the last
I'll take
question.
Okay, then we'll end on one line. I'll start with you, Raj. What has your experience been living in Berlin/Europe, which was and is the epicenter of colonial history, yet a place where often the role in colonial history is denied? And often the responsibility of colonialism is kind of shoved over to the U.S., which is your home country.
Well, and so much to say. I guess first and foremost, part of where this body of work came out of, like I made a project called Blowback where I started looking at early anthropological figures, and I also started looking at the iconography of terrorism and sort of putting them together. And so like I wanted to and the reason I started putting these things together was because my experience of living in Europe was that there's always this unease and disquiet around black and brown bodies in public space that was rarely spoken of, but I felt it. And so then for me as an artist, it's like, how do I exaggerate this fear? So what is the biggest fear? It's the terrorist. It's the person who's going to come into your space and violate it in a way. But someone like Bell Hooks reminds you that if you're a victim of assault, it's going to be from people that look like you and not from some strange, mysterious stranger. And so there's that. The thing about Germany not being part of colonial history. Part of my research that, like, in all over the world is that what I found is that Germans were doing huge amounts of scholarship that were informing the colonial projects for France and England. So I was at Harvard looking at 19th century their archives in their anthropology department, and they're all made up of German scientists. And so there's just like, there's such a kind of crossover of histories within Europe that you cannot kind of sort of like separate or isolate. And so like I think the German scholarship that happened under the colonial era built up and propped up a lot of the kind of larger, more traditional colonial powers that you think of. Being an American, I often think of America as the bastard child of Europe. We took everything from Europe and turned it up 1,000 notches and made it much worse. I very much think about America as an imperial and a colonial power, and related. For me, I'm trying to talk about a kind of larger, universal experience of colonial violence that I draw on people like Frantz Fanon, and these certain voices of Du Bois. They are voices that universality to how they talk about the colonial encounter that really speaks to me deeply. And so then, as an artist, I'm trying to make a visual work about colonial history that is also equally, or tries to aspire to being universal in that way.
Thank you. And that's a great segue into my last question for you, Helen, as well, because your work also takes on colonial histories, but you're quite interested in colonial industries, as you call them. Could you tell us a bit more about that and what about it exactly interests you?
I guess it's about the complexity and the relationships between industry, labour, forced migration, coming together really in a conversation. So, I mean, yeah, I can't, I'm still what you were saying, really, but the kind of the idea of, you know, Franz Fanon, all of those are really significant conversations, and I suppose what I'm aiming to do is look at kind of intersectionality, and so how can you look at histories that look at culture, that look at kind of social structures, and you don't look at economic structures, and you don't look at the impact on the ecology, and you don't look at the kind of repercussions for kind of what's happening globally. Like, how can you separate any of those conversations? And so I'm not always interested in kind of industries, and I think going to Barbados was the first time that I really became interested in that and looked at the impact of that. But I'm also interested in the kind of the way that impacts on an individual psyche, on a collective psyche. So I'm also interested in Franz Fanon and the kind of conversations that happen. And I'm just absolutely fascinated by the way that everything interlinks. So I am interested in bringing different kinds of voices together. And I don't think that really answers the question. But it's about, I suppose it is about what I'm interested in bringing conversations together. I'm bringing concepts together, different kinds of structures together, and if you can't see them as crossing over, having intersections, you can't think in terms of intersectionality, you can't make sense of anything, you can't unpick histories, you can't understand histories, you can't hear them if you can't see all of the other things. So industries are really important, but they're not more important than kind of culture and literature or music or other ways that we, I guess, access or touch histories. So, you know, they're no more interesting than archives to me, but for this work they were. And then James Baldwin brings in a whole other conversation that was a segue that came through, but, you know, again, that's somebody in terms of literature, but it's also in terms of activism and, you know, his queerness, his blackness, all of the things that he brought into the conversations. I'm interested in having as many different intersectional conversations that I can have in any piece of work. So, yeah, that probably hasn't really answered exactly your question, but it's about the significance of the kind of the idea of colonial industries is one in terms of that whole kind of conversation and bringing lots of voices together, and that's why I use lots of different kinds of references and extracts and fragments because I'm interested in the idea of the multiple voice coming together and coming out as a kind of singular voice, which is my voice, which is how many people work, but I'm doing it in a way that I'm kind of acknowledging that process, and that's what I'm trying to do to create a story that I want to tell, but it's made up of kind of many different voices coming from many different contexts and very different histories and different kinds of archival, different ways of searching archives. So in new work that I've made, I've done all my research online, so it's a kind of completely different way than going into a museum or a kind of a different kind of historical archive. But the idea is that you're kind of collecting and you're reading and you're understanding all the different kinds of conversations that go on, or as many as you can.
Well, thank you so much, Helen and Raj, for your contribution, for making this exhibition possible, for your amazing work, and for allowing us to understand a bit more about your process and your purpose. And thank you.